part, so don't know yet. Okay, so somewhere I've got PowerPoint, and let me, oh, what's the order? Well, okay, so let me first, I guess, share desktop, and then start the slideshow. And okay, so everything is in the proper place. And get my chat open just in case. Okay, so I can sort of see the chat, but it's not directly in my line of vision. So it may take a while before I actually see something. And again, so if you have a question, you can just say. And if you want to turn on your camera, that's good too. But the example, this is a bit more on navigation, and half on navigation, I guess, and half on more information about dependency injection and context, okay, with a CDI specification. And then there's a lot of stuff. I'm going to leave some stuff for next term on CDI, but there will be stuff that I will never talk about just because it's special cases. And the main principles are actually, we're done this week on CDI, but there'll still be things that you have to work through. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so the main focus, I don't know, 70% anyway this term, is on the user input side of things. And I'm basically assuming that you've seen JavaScript in an earlier class, at least basic JavaScript. So this is another way of doing user interfaces, which is basically composing them on the server side and then serving them up. And all these choices have lots of implications. Most people don't get into them. Eventually, you should learn the pros and cons of making your own choices on all of that. Okay, but before we get there, we sort of have to have a menu of options to choose from, so then we can discuss the choices. So if you're doing a web user interface, there's sort of two popular styles. One is everything inside of one page, where I swap out the contents, and the other thing is going from page to page. And both of those are common. You know, the sort of percentage one where the other does go back and forth, but you sort of have to know how to do both. So here I'm saying, okay, well, say we're doing multi-page application, then how do I get from page to page? Okay, so that's called navigation, and that's what I'm talking now. And things change when you go from a small single-person application to a big, dozen-person application, which maybe has to survive several years of use. So if you're just doing something small, then you can use practices which do not scale up. And so that we saw already, okay, which is static navigation. In other words, in one page, I put the actual name of the next page to go to. And because it's coded in the page itself, it's static, it doesn't change, it's always the same way. Sometimes that's okay, sometimes that's too limited. Okay? So, as I say here, it's hardwired into the web page. And that will not deal very well where you have a dynamic choice of going one page to another. Okay. So for a static navigation, you just put the name of the page in the action attribute. So action is login. It will look for login x.xhtml. Okay. Now the other choice is that I call a method which returns a string, and I use the string to decide what page to go to next. And I could again return the name of the page, but that has too tight a coupling. In other words, the source page would have to know the name of the destination page. So what most people do is have a level of indirection, where the source page returns something called, I'm calling it here an outcome. It's something that is symbolic of what happened. And then I have configuration information that says, okay, if this happened, where do I want to go next? And it's a little bit of overhead in the simple case, but it allows you to do the more complicated cases easier. Okay. So if you're using navigation rules and they would go in the faces config file, which I already mentioned, then it will go through the rules, it will check them, look for a match. If nothing matches, it goes back to the same page. Okay. So that means that there are some fun errors that you can get if you wind up not navigating and you thought you should. Then look at the rules and see whether or not you were intending to use a rule, but nothing actually matched. Okay. It turns out as well, if you get an error, okay, so if you go back at this point, I expect you to know the JSF lifecycle. It's highly quizzable in case we have the threatened quiz next Monday, so better know it. Then what you see in that slide, that was in the first week, is that if you get an error in validation, in conversion, then you go back to the same page. So there's a variety of situations where you think you're getting off of a page, but you're not. And you'll get used to debugging those sort of situations. All right. And I mentioned navigation rules before, but didn't do anything with it. Now here's where we're doing something with it. A rule, and let's see if we just let me zip over to Eclipse if I can. Interesting. So Mac is not letting me. Okay, I'm on that page. There we go. What I found is that with these presentations, Mac can often get confused. Okay, let's see. It's waiting. Okay, so then this is another Mac goodness that Eclipse sometimes waits to do things. So I could say that the more I use my Mac, the more I love Windows. Sounds good. It's not quite actually accurate. This is a Maven file, so I'm finding things there. Okay, so under the webinf, that's where I get my faces config. And if I look at faces config for this example, then we see some navigation rules. But by the way, you can find this code on infoteach.ca, gitlab.infoteach.ca. Okay, so faces config, among other things, can contain a bunch of navigation rules. So here's one, here's another one. Oops, one too many. And thank you, Eclipse. Okay, here's another one. There's another one. And don't think it matters whether they go before or after the application, which identifies my message bundle. But here I've got them before. Okay, so we've got a sequence of navigation rules. Now each navigation rule has a from. So what's that? So back. Okay, if I can get back to my slide, seemed to work. So the from view ID tells you the starting page. Okay, so all of this navigation is happening at the very last JSF phase, where it's going to render the next view, render response. And so the navigation rule says, okay, first, where am I coming from? And I say here omit to match in the initial page, which does work. But it turns out that in the latest and greatest schema, which Eclipse is checking, that it seems to want a from view ID. And when I looked at the schema, which is not a pleasant thing, those aren't pleasant reading, it does look to me like it does require a view ID. So if you don't have a view from view ID, you'll get an Eclipse error. It will still work. You want to get rid of the Eclipse error, put a from view ID star for from anywhere, which you see in the example code. And then if that page is matched, then it will then go through and look at the navigation cases, see if it can find a match there. You can specify a specific action that you're coming from. That's a nice to have. Usually you don't do that. The more common case is you're getting an outcome. Okay, so I said on the previous slide that an action method will return an outcome, which is a string, and then that can match a rule. And you can do fairly fancy rules with regular expressions, things like that. I'm not going to illustrate that this time, but I am going to see specific outcomes. So if you match a specific outcome, then you go to the toViewID page. So that tells you where you go. So basically, you've got a set of rules. First, where are you coming from? And then what was the outcome? And then that tells you where you go next. Okay? So that's the basic idea. And the whole point of all this is that depending on what the user did, which is then going to wind up as, say, form data, typically, then you want to do something accordingly. And the easiest case is whether or not the data is valid. That's sort of a nice black-white thing. But the other thing is that, depending on what they're asking you to do and the state of your application, I mean, this is very high level and generic, then you might want to do something different. And the example is another quiz to just try and illustrate the possibilities. Okay, so the new thing this week is that in the command button, which we saw last week and used in the lab, I can put a method call in the action property. Okay, so the syntax is action equals, and now I have expression language. Okay, so that hash sign and braces is expression language. Inside of that, I have some bean, and then a period. And now this is the name of a method. So it's not a property, it's not a getter or setter, it's the name of the method. So what I would expect here, since I don't have any parameters, is I have a 0 argument verify user method in the login controller. Okay, now that's different code, so I can't show you that. So when the page is submitted, at the point it gets to apply application, it then calls the method that's listed there. And then that method, at that point, you've gone through conversion and validation and putting the data in the model. So all of the beans have their properties. So this method can use the beans and the properties and do whatever you want to do. You're in Java, okay? So you can do anything you want. And at the end of doing whatever it needs to do, whatever side effects, maybe store things in databases, depends. Then you say, okay, where do you go next? And returns an outcome. Okay. If you want to go to the same page, wherever that's from, then you can return null. That's valid. Now, if you look at the details, really the signature of the method is it returns an object in general. And if you get back an object instead of a string, then you just call the object's toString method, because every object has a toString method. So one way or the other, you wind up with a string, which is then checked with the navigation file. Okay, and okay. Example, a quiz, and this one has a little bit fewer strange things because now we can navigate. Okay, so I've got a quiz bean that keeps track of a question number and how many times something's been answered. And what I want is that I display a question and then the answer is right or wrong. If I get a right answer, I go to something that says, very good. It's a success page. If I get the wrong answer, I'm actually going to give the person 2 chances. So I go to a, you got it wrong the first time page, which I'm calling an again page. And the second time, that's it, you failed. And then you get a new question on a failure page. And then as well, this will keep track, instead of just looping around like we did last week, this will keep track of the fact that you've done the last question and go to another page. And if you start over again, it will go back, as I recall, it shuffles. Does it shuffle the question? Don't remember. In any case, it goes back to the index page. Okay, so this is what's wanted. So at this point, I can lay this out without doing any JSF, any Java, or whatever. This is just designing my user interface. What do I want? So I can sort of sketch out on a piece of paper or whatever. Okay. And so these are some mock-ups, if you will. So on the initial question, I want to say, okay, my question, a text box for the answer, and then a button to check the answer. If the answer was wrong, then I get a try again, which was the again page. Put out the question again, another text box. Okay. If I get a second wrong answer, then I want to say that was not correct. The correct answer was, and give them the answer. And then another question. Okay, so something like this. And if you get the answer from any of these 2 pages, okay, the first 2, then or on the third one, but with the next question, then you say, okay, great, that was correct, and tell them their score and give them the next problem. Okay, and at the point that you finish everything, then you give a results page. And if I say over, then I initialize the quiz and start over again. All right, so in initializing the quiz, I could do whatever I want. I could get different questions. In a real life situation, you would pull the questions from a database, most likely. You could shuffle things if you want. You could change, have different kinds of questions. Again, this is just a framework for a simple example. Okay, so now, again, before I get to any Java, I can lay out what I want for the pages. And I can also draw a little diagram that says, okay, what are my pages? How do I get from page to page? So this is basically a state diagram, which you may or may not have seen. So here I've got each page in an oval, and then I've got a line with the possible responses characterized. Okay, so I'm putting down the outcomes, if you will. So from the initial page, which had a question, the question is right or wrong. And I'm saying that if it's wrong, well, since this is the very first page, it must have been wrong once. So I should give it another chance. So that's an again path. If it's right, then that's a success path. And success, I'm displaying the next question. So I again have 2 possibilities. It was right or wrong. And I go to different places. If I get something wrong from the again, then that's a failure. So I go to the failure page, and so on and so on. And whenever I've answered all the questions one way or the other, then I'm done. So I go to the done page, have the result, and then start over. It takes me back to the index page again. So at this level, I can sort of debug my navigation logic and make sure that no matter what happens, I can characterize it and I've got a page to go to. And again, I don't need any code, any implementation, anything to think this through. Okay, it's a totally logical thing. And then once I've got it, then I can analyze it and I could say that, well, when does the page I go to depend on the outcome, which is on the line? And in many cases, the outcome itself determines the page. It doesn't matter where I came from. So if I get an again, if I look at all the agains, no matter where they come from, they're always going to the again page. So I don't need to use the view there. I can only use the outcome. Okay, now, and if I get a success, that seems to always go to the success page. Done always goes to the done page. So it looks like the outcomes in this particular case are not dependent on where I'm coming from. So I don't need that much navigation. Okay, but it's I'm going to use a little bit more than is actually necessary just to illustrate the possibilities. And we'll look at the code in a second. What I'm trying to do here is see how far we can get before we have to look at the code to understand it. Okay, so and as well in this case, success again and done, because my outcome is the same as the page, then I can just treat those as static. And if I change my mind, I can always put a navigation case for it. But what this is saying is that, well, wherever I'm coming from, this is a navigation rule. So the first rule is wherever I'm coming from, if I get to start over, I go to the index page. And since that outcome is not the same as the name of the page, I would have to have a navigation rule to do that. And if I'm in again, okay, and I've got a failure, then I go to the failure page. And if I get a failure from anywhere else, I go to the again page. Okay, that wasn't quite what the diagram said, but that gives me some possibility of not having to contextualize how many times I've failed, but just put out failure in either case. And this would also work. Okay, so again, you've got lots of possibilities, and in general, there's lots of different ways of doing it. The point of using navigation rules is that you allow people to make changes to the website as maintainers without having to be coders. One big issue behind all of this is separation of concerns. When you get projects that aren't tiny, they don't even have to be big, but you very quickly get people that are specialized. So you have people that are software developers that are specialized in code. You have people that are layout artists that had to learn CSS, HTML, tags, things like that. And then you have maintainers after the system is running that don't know any of that. And so it helps if each of those people can do their job without having to worry about learning everybody else's technologies. And so a good technology for those situations is one that separates the concerns and doesn't force everybody to see all of the details. And these navigation rules and so on are adding to that. These are for maintainers. Now, if your maintainer is a developer and your developer is also a designer, then a lot of this is not so critical. So then action methods. Okay, well, it turns out that for each of the different pages, then I'm going to call an action answer until the results page, and then I call a start over action. So the question is, okay, how do I get this one method to deal with all of the issues? Well, okay, I mean, you don't have to do it this way. You could have different methods, and then you'd have different logic in your Java code. So here, I'm going to maintain internal state in the quiz bean class that knows, what's the next question and so on. But in general, the action methods will update whatever the state of the bean is, the internal state of my problem, and then taking into account what the user did, return an outcome that then takes me to the next page. Okay? And we'll start over then, and I'm going to reset the score, shuffle the quiz. Now, at the moment, that only happens when you're done. But with this backend logic, you could put another button on the intermediate pages that said, okay, I'm out of here, I want to start over. And you wouldn't have to change the Java with any luck. It should just work. Okay, so let's just have a quick look at the code. If I can get, okay. We will go there when I get back, but come on. Oh, Mac, there we go. It's a bit recalcitrant today. So the, and let's see, is my, let's, okay, get something out of the way and get to my server view. And is my server running? It stopped, so we'll start it up. And, okay. Let's see, did it really change? And, okay, it doesn't look like it really changed as far as Git is concerned. So it's listening. Now, where do I have a browser? I also, if I, let's see, okay. If I connect to BCIT, and so I'm connected, and so I go back to the 3910 and look at the topology view. Then I happen to have the navigation page sitting there. So the easiest way to run it is to click on that. And now I'm running the one that's on the cloud. And okay, so that's correct. The first 4 bytes happen to be Cafe Babe. That's a useful bit of trivia. Yeah, I'm trying to clean up because each of these, especially with Chrome, it really gobbles memory. And, so it's annoying to have like 2 gigabytes for Chrome and another 2 gigabytes for Brave, on and on. Okay, so 1, 2, and those are correct. And so we give it some wrong answers. Please try again and give it another wrong answer. And then it gives me the right one. And okay, oak, I happen to know is the right answer to that one. Okay, point in time. That is the often deprecated date. and then that's it. There's my score, and then if I start over again, it's in a different order. Okay. Now go to that, go somewhere else. And I also, because I'm running my local one, I can go localhost 8080 LOCAL host 80/ch3 dash navigation. Okay, and this looks like the same thing, except it's running a different place. Okay, and okay, still not correct. And that's, do I have that one? Yeah. Oh, actually, let's okay. Check the case where we only have one wrong answer. Okay, so that seems to work. Extends, and so on. Okay, so to get everything to work, we've got, let's see, source, main, web app. Okay, so I've got all these pages. And, but by the way, there's the RESTful ones, I never actually demo. And with the current version, I've actually got a problem report out on myself because they don't do anything sensible, and I don't have the book in front of me. I'm not sure what the author had intended on that example. So I'm just leaving the RESTful ones as not working. And we haven't talked about REST yet anyway. And when we get to it, it will turn out not to have been that relevant, but just in case you're wondering. Okay, so if I start at the index, that is going to send me off to the quiz. And so I look at the quiz one, and now this is externalized the prompts in a properties file as earlier, so that I can put in whatever language I want, just I need translators. And what would be nice, but I don't know if Eclipse will do that. No. See, it would be nice if Eclipse would follow the property and give me the results, but instead I have to run it. So that's okay. We did that. And the main issue is, the new thing is the method in the action. Okay, so that will call it an answer action. And if I look at the other one, so the again one calls action, and the done one calls start over action. Failure is calling answer action. And we saw this output format with a parameter last time. Okay, that plugs in the answer in this message. I showed you how to do that last time. And success also has answer action. Okay, and I'm pulling the message for the next problem or whatever, and the question out of the QuizBean. So there's a lot of QuizBean stuff. So that means some Java somewhere. So we go look at Java. And we see three things there. By the way, if I see Java code here that's not actually being used, then I know that I've reused a project and not cleaned it up. So that's not so good. So the problem is, just a standard Java class with a little bit of data, question and answer, getters and setters. And in addition, I have a useful thing to say, is the answer correct or not? And there I'm throwing away garbage at the end of the answer, so I trim it. And I also don't want to have upper or lowercase be significant, so I use equals in lowercase. And you can be as fancy as you want there. Okay, and then the quiz bean, which is the other one I'm going to show. I'm not going to get into the rest part. So I've got a current problem, the number of tries for a particular question, the score, the response, and I'm initializing that as no response, and then the correct answer. And I've got a hardwired list of problems. And then, get question, get answer, get score, so they can be displayed on the page. And response. And now on the last week's, the set response had a side effect, which was sort of ugly. This one is just a setter. Okay, so that's more reasonable because now the logic as it should be is in the action method. So I've got two of them, start over and answer, and then some helper methods. So obviously next problem is being private wouldn't be one of my responses. So if I get an answer, then I increment the number of tries and say, okay, is it correct? If it's correct, then you bump up the score and get the next problem. If my problem is the last one, then I return done. Okay, because it was a correct response, otherwise I return success. And else it was incorrect. So if the number of tries was 1, then I return again. And otherwise, then must be a second failure, except it might have been the last problem. So I have to check whether or not it was the last problem. If the last problem, I return done, otherwise I return failure. And start over resets, current problem, score, tries, response. After shuffling, fortunately, Collections has a really nice shuffle method, so I hope that works, and assume that it does. And going on to the next problem, I also set the tries back to 0, and bump the problem number up, and store the correct answer in a pleasant place. Okay, and what scope is this? Okay, so I'm putting this in the session, which means that if I run this through separate tabs, then both tabs are going to see one quiz. If I wanted the quizzes to be different across different tabs, I would have to use conversation and stick in a bit more logic. Okay. So that's all the pieces that make things work. So again, if I'm only looking at the code, then how would I figure it out? Well, okay, I've got 2 action methods which are named so that I can pick them out. They don't have to be called answer action. It could just be called answer and start over. That's a stylistic thing. And from this, I can see that I've got done, success, the things that can be returned, those are the outcomes. And this one answer action method actually gives you what it looks like 4 possibilities. Yes, 4 possibilities. So it's really the main driver of where do I go next. And then what page is that? Well, I need to look at the navigation, which has now disappeared off here. Faces config. So I have to remember that navigation rules are in faces config. Okay. Now, and again, for a simple web page, I can just hard code and use static, or I could use sort of semi-static in that in the quiz bean, I make my outcomes be the names of the pages. So I can get some dynamicness without having a navigation configuration. But you should always keep in the back of your mind that you might want to externalize the navigation so it's not hard-coded in your Java code and in the pages. And that gives you more flexibility. If you use the names of the pages as the outcomes, then that's sort of a middle range compromise. I can always add in the navigation later. But now, for the most part, I prefer using annotation. So here's annotation, these things with the @ signs, over configuration in XML or YAML for that matter. But here I'm using XML. So you might ask yourself, why? That would be a good thing to do, to ask yourself, why am I doing things? Is there a deep rationale? Am I playing, 4D chess? Or is it just totally random and, not something to emulate? And sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. But what we'll see is that when we're wiring beans together, I generally prefer to have it in the code itself because that's the place that you look for it. But for navigation, because I'm saying that somebody, when they're maintaining the site, might want to change this, I will push it out into configuration. But again, that's your choice when you're building something. And how much do you want it to be maintainable? How much annoyance are you willing to suffer to make it maintainable? I'm just sort of giving you the pieces. Whenever you're looking at any framework, those are the sorts of things that you should evaluate on how do you handle it in the various cases that you might be in. Okay, so that's the main part of navigation. So let's go back and look at a few advanced issues. Okay, so you can put these other tags, description, display name, icon, and that way, if you have a tool that picks those up, it'll make life a little bit easier for people. That's not a big deal. The next thing is critical though, which is the distinction between forward versus redirection. And there's different ways of doing this, but the most important thing is to know what is the difference. And I mentioned that earlier, so you got to pick it up at some point. I will review it here, which is to say that forwarding is meaning that I'm doing the navigation on the server side. The browser is not aware of what's going on. They just get a response. Okay, so that's the fastest, most efficient. So that's the default case. And the implication is that my target page is in the same request as the source page. So anything that I've got in request scope is still visible in the target page. So I can use that to move information from the first page to the second page if I want to. I didn't use that in this instance. The flip side is that the browser will show you the original page in the URL part, which occasionally is confusing. And so if you want the browser to indicate the target page rather than the source page, then you need to use redirection. And that does an extra round trip to the browser. So it's a bit slower. And there's a couple of ways I can do that. If I'm using navigation, then I use an empty redirect tag, and that will do redirection, which for the most part we will not do. Okay, so a little bit of a description on that on paper. If you want the user, as I say here, to be able to bookmark the target, well, then give them something that they can see to bookmark, then you want to redirect. The other thing is that if I want to be sure that my target page is getting a new request, so I don't have to by hand change the input values, they're just automatically zeroed out because I've got a new request, then I can use redirection. Okay, so there's some techniques which you do by using the correct scope. And we'll see that in some of the labs. So with the this week's lab, it was a 2-page where we were going back and forth. Data entry page, display page. And if I go back to the data entry page, then that was supposed to be a new problem, so it should be zeroed out. And how do I get a nice clean form? Well, if you use session scope, then you'll see that the data is still there, so you have to zero it out in the code. Clear out the strings and so on. That's unnecessary code. If you use request scope, then by the time when you go back, it will be another request, and you'll get a new clean form, and that's what you want. So the scope that works best for Lab 2 is request scope. Now, if I might want to go to an edit page, then it gets more complicated. And we're going to play with conversation scope, which is sort of the cleanest way of doing that. Okay, but at this point, you need to know the difference between forward and redirection and be conscious of what you're using and what the difference is. That winds up being important. Okay, so request scope does not survive redirection. And if you want to have data go from page to page and you're in a different scope, then conversation scope is a good solution. Okay, and there are some extra scopes besides the 4 that I talk about. I've thought about talking about them frequently and decided that it's not worth burdening you with that information. If you're interested in looking at those other scopes, feel free. But there's a variety of issues that make them not as wonderful. As again, I'm not going to list you those things. I will leave that for you to discover if you want to or not. Okay, but we have to understand the 4 scopes that we're dealing with. Okay, but by the way, whatever technology you're using, there will generally be a request scope and a session scope and maybe an application scope there. Conversation scope is sort of a JSF thing. But the other ones are fairly common across technologies, but of course each technology has its own way of dealing with it. Okay, and the RESTful stuff, as I say, I'm going to talk about REST later. If you want to prepare for it, review your HTML, HTTP standards, and the HTTP methods, get, post, which are extremely commonly used, and also put and delete, because those will come back later on. Okay. There's a little helpful diagram of navigation, and as I say, it used to be that according to this, the from view ID is optional, and it seems to be as far as what works. But formally, you should probably have one because the schema seems to want it from view ID, at least the way I read it. Okay. And again, you could also go to the examples. Okay. So you can use wildcards in the from view, and I used just a plain asterisk in the example. And very occasionally you'll get things where you've got the same outcome, but you want a different page depending on the actual action. Okay, now that's probably bad design, but if you get yourself in that situation, you can do it by putting the actual action that got you there. And I don't think I've ever actually used this in real life. And there's a few other fancy things that you can do, but this is enough for us. Okay, so that's it for the first hour. And this is a summary. I've talked about all of it, so I'll give you a break, and then we'll talk about CDI things. So any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions in the chat. Okay, so okay, stop sharing, and then we
Okay, so let's continue. Any questions that came up during the break? No, so let's go back to the screen share. And that takes us back to the slides. And I just need to drag the chat over again. Open up that. Good. Okay, so summary sounds like we're done, but no, not quite. One more fun-packed 50 minutes. So CDI beans. Now, my guess is that even though I have this as a, I guess, required reading, and I put it on D2L to make it convenient for you, probably most of you haven't looked at it. The first couple of chapters are worth looking at, the JSR 365. It's pretty readable, and you can actually find useful things in that. But if I decide that it's worth your attention enough that I'm going to threaten you with quiz questions out of it, I will give you advanced warning. Okay, so as I say, it's useful stuff. Some years I require students to know more than other years, and we'll see where we go with that. Okay, but one of the things that I didn't want to throw in last week in the initial discussion is the possibilities of bean discovery. So it turns out that a CDI bean is basically a Java class that has perhaps annotations, and any concrete class could be treated as a CDI bean. As long as it's possible to know what constructor to use. So if you have a zero argument constructor, then you can create an object and go from there. Now, just because any class can be used doesn't necessarily mean that you want them all to be used as CDI beans. So if you care, you can, the specification allows you to tailor it so that you know exactly which Java classes are going to be used as CDI beans and which are not. Okay? And there are a few cases that we haven't seen yet where you definitely do not want something to be used because that would break other things. Okay, so it is an issue of which are my beans. Okay, and so to deal with that, a bean archive allows you to say, how do you discover which beans are CDI beans? And so if you have a beans XML file, then that gives you a place to put down the discovery mode. Okay, so you have these three kinds of discovery modes. So the first one is that every class that's in the archive. Okay, now what's an archive? Well, our project as a whole is a web archive. If I put things in a jar file, that's also an archive, a Java archive. So there's a few others. But for the moment, all of the classes that are going into the WAR file, unzipped is a directory hierarchy. Those would be the archive we're talking about. Okay? So all says everything can be injected, so everything is a CDI bean. You can say that only the ones that have some annotation that tells me that they're a CDI bean can be ejected. Okay, so that's the annotated possibility. Or you could say that none of the beans in this archive can be ejected. Okay, now, then the next question is, what happens if you don't say? Well, again, this is unfortunately a historical thing. So the discovery mode is something that happened with version 2 of CDI. Version 1, they hadn't thought of it. So there's a possibility you don't have any beans XML at all, which is what I showed you in the example so far. Or you have a beans XML that indicates that it's late enough that it has the discovery mode and it's annotated. Okay. And so if you have an implicit archive, then, which is what you get with no beans XML, then the things that are picked up are the ones that have a bean defining annotation, including session beans that we haven't seen yet. Okay, so there are fairly complex rules of saying what exactly is a bean defining annotation. And for that, I'll refer you to the spec if you care. But the short answer is that it's a scope, including dependent scope. Okay, so request scoped with a D, session scoped, conversation scoped, application scoped, or at dependent. Those 5 possibilities. In particular, at named doesn't do it for you. All right. So if you get in a situation where it can't find your bean, the first thing to look for when you're in debug mode is maybe the combination of beans XML or not, and version or not, and so on, and annotation or not, said that it wasn't a bean. Okay. And if you throw in a scope declaration including dependent, if you expect dependent scope, rather than just relying on a default scope of dependent. Okay, to get the default scope of dependent, that means it did pick it up as a bean, even though you didn't have a scope. Okay, and that's a bit hazardous. So really, you should put a bean defining scope on all of your CDI beans. That way you consciously think about it, and you're good. Okay. So implicit, you've also got explicit. And that will contain the beans XML file. So no XML file, it's implicit. XML file, well, it depends. So if there's an empty file or one that doesn't have a version, then it is an explicit archive. Okay, and that has the discovery mode of all, which means that they are all of the classes and types are considered for injection. They are CDI beans. Well, a type, an interface would be a type. And if I have something that would have been picked up, but I don't want it to be picked up, then I can still annotate it with @vetoed. That to me is a hard one to remember. Okay, but something that you decide definitely shouldn't be a CDI bean. And right now, there's not really anything that you would want to do that with, but that there is that possibility. Okay, so explicit, either empty file, no version number, or a later one. So if you pull in the current version, then which should be version 2.0, then you have the possibility of putting bean discovery mode, and if you say all, then it's explicit bean archive, and they're all there. You're at that point you have the possibility of saying annotated, which you know that it's annotated ones, or none, in which case it'll be none. Okay, so this is sort of a historical annoyance, if you will, and I can see how it might be slightly cryptic to you, but I give you these 2 slides to spell it out because I have seen people accidentally, they create something, they create a new beans XML file by using new beans XML file at Eclipse. So it pulls in a non-empty one, and then they get surprised. And they don't think to look at it and see that it actually has a discovery mode set. Okay. Anyway, that's something that causes, I guess this is one of these traps for the beginners that's really annoying, but once you get the hang of it, it's not such a big deal. And if you get fancier and you care, then you can tailor the archive with a specific discovery mode. Okay. So I haven't said much about actually injecting beans, but that is what was the subject of this week's lab. I set it up so that you had to create a project bean and inject it into a problem report bean or something like that. And the whole point of that was to get you playing with injection to see how that worked and the pros and cons. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about what gets injected, how that works, and then different ways of dealing with special cases. Okay, how do I get something that gets injected? Usually I call a constructor, but I could call a method to get something as well. And what are the possibilities to make sure that you get the right thing injected? It turns out that the system will take care of the fact that you have exactly one possibility where you inject something. So you can't go wrong. But if you have zero possibility or more than one, then you will have to sort that. And one of the ways of sorting it is to define a qualifier. And unfortunately, I have to cover a little bit more Java that you probably didn't see, which is how do you define annotations? Those are things that you can create. Okay? And then depending on, sometimes I don't get to alternatives, but we'll see. Okay. So an injection point is an issue of Java code. So I'm writing Java code, and I have a variable. I want to put something in it. So at this point, to put something in the variable, you have to create it. You have to create a value, either primitive type or an object reference. If it's an object reference, then you have to create an object somehow and store it. Okay, so that's your life till this week, actually. And so now the other possibility is I just say I want something, and I'm running in a context where some sort of system, server, container is able to find what I want and give me a reference to it. Okay, so when to do that, I take the variable, that's the base case, that I want to have a value put in, and I annotate it with @inject. Okay, so that identifies an injection point. Now, really what it does directly is it puts an annotation in your code. And the annotations, if you look at the definition of the annotation, then you'll see that, as I'll get to momentarily, is that it can survive into your compiled code in runtime. So it can make it into the class file. And when it's in the class file, then anybody can look at it and see that it's there. And if you're running in a context where you have code that cares, it can then do special things as a result. Okay, so that's sort of how it works. So you've got these three possibilities. One, which is sort of clever, is I have a constructor. Okay, you hopefully remember about constructors. I annotate one of them with @inject. And I can only have one. Okay, so what that says is that when the bean I'm defining in this class is injected, call this constructor, And if it has parameters, inject them first. Okay, so the normally, if you need to create an object and it's being created by a framework, then it'll call a zero argument constructor because it doesn't know how to get the arguments. What this says is, yeah, here's how to get the arguments, just inject them and do the injection process recursively, if you will. Okay. So that's slightly fancy. The next two are more common. I can annotate a setter or a field. And in either case, it will then find the object that's to be injected, return a generally a reference. If it's an object, it would be a reference that's returned, and either call the setter with that reference or put it directly into the field. Okay, and producer methods, we'll get to those on a subsequent slide. So in this week's lab, in the report bean, you're supposed to have a project field and then put an @inject in front of the project field, and then it would inject. It would create a project object, inject it. Okay, so that was the usage. Okay, now often it's easy to get the thing that's being injected. Okay, so with the project bean that was going to be injected, I'm just creating an object, a project object, and that's all I want. Anyone will do. And I identified the type, and so the CDI container goes off, calls project.newInstance, gets a new instance, and then returns the reference and stores it. Okay, so that's the usual case. But sometimes it's trickier than that, as I say here. Maybe you want to populate the project with data, which is coming out of database, so you need to do a lot of hard work to get it set up. And the easiest way to do that is to call a method to create the object. So that's called a producer method. It's a method that produces objects. And so that goes down to the list of possibilities for getting objects to inject. And I do that by annotating a method with @produces. So when that annotation is processed, at the point that you deploy your application, then the CDI container gets a list of ways of making objects for injection purposes. And it just makes a note that here's another way of getting an object of the return type. Okay. And as I said, there has to be exactly one way of doing it, otherwise it's ambiguous, and your project will not deploy. So in general, you don't have to worry about it too much. Okay, so question, how can you access the properties of the injected object? Well, in the normal way, you access anything in Java. If you're doing it in Java itself, then you call a getter or a setter from the field. Okay. In other words, once it's injected, it's just you can't really tell how you created it. Doesn't matter. You've got a reference which points to an object. Now, in expression language, I just use dotted notation. So if I have a report bean which contains a project which contains a name, then I would say, so what did I call it? Okay, now the next question is, can I type? Let's see. So say my report bean is called report. So then I would just say dollar brackets. I'm saying, I'm assuming here that I named it report. And then the field is going to be called, okay, so this would have to have getters and setters, project. And then it has a name or a title. So say I want the name. And that's how I would use it in a web page. Okay. And so see, project name is not going to work because that's actually for project.name to work, I would have to have a name project, which means that I would have to have at named on the project bean itself. But I didn't want that, and it's not necessary. And it wouldn't really be useful because you want the project that's associated with the report, not just any project. Okay, so the way it's set up, the project itself has dependent scope, which means that every time I inject it, I get a new one. Every time I create one, I get a new one. So if I use it directly in the web page, the one that I created and stored the value in would not be the same object that I read the value from, and I'd have mysterious bugs. Okay, so the report bean itself, that's being put into a known scope. So it's going to stay around for me to play with. And I can use the dot notation to get to its properties. And in turn, further dots to get to their properties. Okay, and that's sort of the point, one of the main points of the lab, is to have you stumble through that. Okay, so hopefully that helps. And as I say, you can make project.name by itself work, but you don't want to, because that's going to uncover other issues. And several of the things you can do to get around the dot notation is you could have a name field in the report bean, which delegates to the project name field. But again, that's just wasted code. Okay, so what I put in the chat, report.project.name, that's the sort of structure that you can do with injection and you should do in general. Okay, now in this case, it's a bit awkward. Why do I need this separate project bean? Well, just to show you injection. Okay, it's artificial. Okay. And so, but in general, whenever you're using injection, and whenever you're using expression language with a root bean, like the first one that's in the string of notations, the container is responsible for creating the instance, not your code. And you have to allow the container to create it. If you create it yourself using new, then that will break a whole bunch of stuff. You know, like something you create with new does not wind up being in any sort of scope. You have to let the container create it to put it in the right scope. Now, mind you, I mean, with a lot of programming, you could put it in the right scope yourself manually, but then you're just doing extra work. Okay, so back to producer methods. So here's an example, and illustrates a couple of things. Okay, so I've got a bean that, again, just to throw it somewhere, I'm throwing an application scope because I want a random number generator, which is going to be used anywhere. So that seems like a reasonable place to put it. And I have a producer method because it has @produces. And it's returning an int. Okay, so get random number. When I call it, I return random.nextInt. That's something that I covered in the early stages of 1510, so you might have seen that. And so the fact that it produces says, if I've now got a situation where I can inject an int, which is the base type. Okay, but then you think, well, okay, int is pretty commonly used type. there's probably a lot of places that I could get an int. So maybe better be a bit more specific. So I define a qualifier random, and I throw in that as well. So now to do the injection, I have to have not only say at int plus the type, but disambiguate it by putting the qualifier. So this says find something that will produce an int which is annotated with random, and looks through all the code. This is the only place that it finds. So this is what gets called to get your random thing. Now, these two boxes down at the bottom are separate places of code. So one way of using the thing at the top is I could inject it. And the other way is to do it in expression language by name. And I can do that because I gave it a name. I said at named, and I didn't give it a specific name, so then it goes to the property, which is decapitalize R, random number. All right, so there's sort of two ways of accessing it: by type in Java, because Java has types, and expression language by name. And both of these, I guess, we will use this sort of thing in next week's lab. Okay. Okay, so let's see. So Alvarez is saying that his class doesn't have the property project. Okay, well, then you didn't create a project field with getters and setters, get project, set project. So that would be the most likely thing. And so add getters and setters, and then because it's your getters and setters that define the properties. Okay, so without looking at the code, that's the most likely problem in the chat. Okay. And so this is just, again, an example of producer. Now, the main thing with producer methods is that most times you don't have to use them. So I'm just showing you how with a slightly contrived example. And that also introduces some other things that are generally useful. Okay. What else? Okay, well, there is an issue of types because injection is, they went out of their way to make it secure. So injection is based on a type of the object. And so I have to figure out what that means from what I see. Okay, so here's these possibilities. Like something that's returned from a method. I could return an interface as a type. That's valid, Java, in which case that interface is one of the possible type. If it extends any interfaces, those are also possible types, and object is always a type, a possible type. Okay. If I'm returning a primitive, in this case int or an array, then it would be that type plus object. And if the type is a class, then it's that class, every superclass, and all of the interfaces that are implemented. So all the way, object is the ultimate superclass, so that gets pulled in as well. So again, it's important to realize this because otherwise you can get confusing error messages. Okay. On the other hand, most of the time, it's not a big deal. So this is sort of keeping in the back of your mind. Now, producer methods can have parameters, in which case they get injected, and the same rules apply recursively, if you will. Okay, so that's producer methods. Okay, you can also have producer fields, where you annotate a field with produces. Okay. And in this case, I would say this is used less often of the possibilities of injection. But again, you go with the type of the field and same rules as before. And you might also have qualifiers, okay, which I'm about to get to. Okay, so the CDI container will go through and find all of these producers fields. And if those are the only way of getting the object, then it will pull the object out of the field and inject it somewhere else. Okay. So what happens when you do injection? Lots of stuff. So again, the idea is that the container is doing it for you. And at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, I could have just said new. It would have been so much easier. And in the short run, that seems like the case. But it turns out that this dependency injection gives you a lot more possibilities of building bigger things and decoupling them and only having to worry about your stuff and on and on and on. Okay, so this is worth knowing. And I think I mentioned before that the initial technology came out of C++. Way in olden times. It was a theoretical thing that somebody thought was useful. And then it turned out to be really useful in modern times. Okay. So what happens? Well, I want to create, the container is going to create an instance. Well, when I created an instance, which is say an object from a class in Java, I've got to call a constructor. That's the only way of getting an instance. One way or the other, eventually I will call a constructor. So the container will call a constructor. Which one? Well, if one is annotated with inject, it'll call that one. If nothing is annotated, if no constructors have inject annotation, it will call a zero parameter one. It's got to have a constructor to call. And again, if there is no constructor according to the rules, error, fix it. Okay, so now it's got a bean and it's got a Java object. The object has gone through and initialized the fields, first zeroing them out and then putting the initial values for ones that have initial values, and then modifying them by the constructors with the call going all the way up to the parent constructor first, and then the parent of that. So object constructors first, and then the subclass to object, and then all the way down to your actual class. So that's all Java. And that's all part of this line. And then it goes through and does the injections. So any fields that have injections, it goes through and finds a bean, going through the whole process again. And then once it does that, if you have any methods that have been put in to initialize things, okay, again, that's Java, then it will call those. And then after that, if you have a method that's annotated as post-construct, it will call that. Okay, so that's a lot. But one of the things that will tell you is that don't expect injection to work in the code that's inside of a constructor. In other words, if you use a field in a constructor that's later going to be injected, it will not have been initialized while you're in the constructor. So you'll get a null pointer exception. Okay, so any fields that are initialized, you can't expect them to be initialized. Any things that are injected won't be initialized in the constructor. By the time you get to a post-construct method, you will know that everything has been initialized, so you can count on it. And by the time you get the reference back and you start calling methods, then all of this will have happened. Okay, so really the only thing that people go wrong is if they try and do things that they shouldn't do in the constructor. And so this will explain the results. Okay. Now, what gets injected? Well, you've got to that. Okay, so that has to be well defined. And if you think about it, imagine what would happen if when I did this injection, I sort of got a random object of a random type. And I didn't know until runtime what I was going to get. Okay, it would be just a total disaster. And I would have a whole pile of hard to find bugs. So all these rules are set to make sure that you get something that is dependable. And if that's not going to be the case, you get an error explicitly so you can fix it. Okay, so the bean that's going to be injected is determined when you initialize your system to deploy. Okay, so it goes through and finds all the injection points, it finds out what it's going to do it, and it makes sure there's only one possibility. Okay, and so that means that on the one hand, you might get a deployment error, which is a bunch of things that you don't want to see, but that's a lot better than just having it fail 5 years downstream at runtime. Okay, and usually there's no problems. Okay, but usually is not always. So again, I have to bring it to your attention. Now it's going to use the type to find a unique object to inject. And since it is possible that multiple classes can implement the same type, to avoid the ambiguity, I can add in things called qualifiers. Okay, so that's one possibility I've got to get to momentarily. The other thing that's sometimes useful is like I want to have a test version and the version that I actually use operationally. So rather than changing the code to change between a test version and the operational version, which I could easily forget to do, the system is set up so I can annotate a class as an alternative and then turn it on and off in configuration. And so that's a less likely possibility. Okay, and then the third thing, which is even less likely, is you're building something really big and you happen to have classes that would conflict, but they're in different teams, so they can be packaged in different modules. And we're not going to go there. Certainly not this term. Okay, so I said that you use qualifiers. So what's that? Well, a qualifier is an annotation that itself is annotated using @qualifier. Okay, so javax.inject.qualifier. Okay. And the whole point is to disambiguate where I've got multiple possibilities for injection and the system can't tell which one. Okay, so I define a qualifier. So you define the qualifiers. So that's Java code. And so on this page, I assume that you know how to define an annotation in Java. Okay, now I'm guessing probably you don't, so I tell you that as well. But sort of suspend disbelief for the moment. So an annotation is something that uses @interface. That's how you define it in Java. So it sort of looks like an interface, except it has this extra @ in front of the reserved word interface. Okay, so now I'm defining an annotation called credit card. Okay, so it's an annotation. Now, I also need to say, what can it be applied to? So that I put in an @target. So that says, okay, it can be applied to any type. It can be applied to a method, to a parameter, to a field. And then the next question is, how long does it stay around? And I usually want it to be available at runtime. But I can just say it's only for compile time or only for build time or something like that. So that's a retention. So bottom 3 lines gives me an annotation, and then annotating with qualifier says I can use it as a qualifier. Now, what I haven't shown you is piles of imports to get the type, method, parameter, field, target, retention, and so on. But if you stick something like this into Eclipse, then Eclipse will show you what the qualifiers are. And let's see, do I have an example? Don't remember. Okay. So let's quickly get through the Java part as well. Once I've got a qualifier, then I can put it on parameters to disambiguate things. And that's done enough that you have to know how to do it. Okay. And any of the places I've said that I can define something that can be injected, I can throw in a qualifier. Okay. Interestingly enough, if I don't have a qualifier, then there's an implicit one, which is at default. And in a way, that's a technicality. Okay. And the idea is that all this business with qualifiers and so on is trying to decouple the specifics. So rather than using a specific concrete class, I will often want to use an interface instead with a qualifier. Okay. So how do I define an annotation? Okay, again, this is basic Java. It's relatively easy to do, but you probably haven't seen it before. It's a bit specialized to cover in any of the Java courses that you've seen because most people don't need it. But as I say, I take interface, put an at in front of it. Now I've got an annotation. And those are applied to things. And the things they're applied to, well, okay, for instance. Now, I'm not going to really cover it, but you can define elements of the annotation. So we've seen like named can take a property. So if you want to do that, you can do that too, but that's getting a bit more into the Java annotations that I'm really going to cover. Okay. Saying where I'm going to put it, well, that's the target. And here's your choices. Again, that's just for being complete and explaining what target means. And similarly, how long it's going to stay around. Here's your possibilities here. And this is just for completeness. Okay. And, oh, this one was slightly, I missed the alignment here. Sorry about that. This then defines a credit card qualifier, and now I can use that qualifier at credit card. And this says that I'm going to look for a payment processor. In this case, it's an interface. So I might have lots of different kinds of payment processors. One of them is annotated with credit card, which we see down here. Okay, so the appropriate class I would annotate with credit card. I need to create objects from classes, not interfaces. And so then when I've done this, it's now presumably there's one unique class I can go to get the object. So even though I put an interface here, because at the point I inject it, I don't know what the class is going to be called, the person that's giving me the resource in their wisdom decides to put it on this particular concrete class. So in my injection point, I don't need to care what the concrete class actually is. And my program doesn't, it uses an interface. This is all probably how useful this is not immediately apparent. That's okay. It will become more apparent over time. Okay, so that's the use of qualifiers. Okay, so as I said, it's not that easy to not have a qualifier, because if I just don't put a qualifier, I've got this at default. Okay, and usually that's fine. If you really, really wanted to get rid of all the qualifiers, then you have to put at any. Okay, so ironically, at any as a qualifier removes all the qualifiers. And that's really only useful when I want to programmatically go through all the possibilities and select one. So in a producer method, I could go through and see what are all the things that could be injected, and for some logical reason, pick one of them. Again, that's a fanciness that you seldom have to do, but that is allowed. If one qualifier doesn't make something unique, but I still have an ambiguity, well, maybe I need more than one qualifier, no problem. And again, so this synchronous would have to be defined. It's not part of the standard. reliable would have to be defined in your own code. It's not part of the standard. And once you've defined it somewhere else, then I can inject something with both of those, which means that somewhere I have to have exactly one place that I've got both of those attached to a class or a producer method. So there's a unique thing that's going to be injected. Okay. So alternatives. Again, the main use for this is that I've seen is in testing, but you could also use it if you really, really need to have different code for different deployment situations. So just for instance, at the moment, we have two main mobile alternatives, Android and iOS. And they are quite incompatible, but people want to produce applications that run on both of those. So there has been a struggle for, I don't know, many years, getting close to a decade, I would guess, but probably not there yet, on how to do this without having duplicate code bases. Okay, so those are the sorts of issues that people try and come up with these things like alternative. But wherever I want to be able to swap in a different actual class without having to change the code, but do it in maintenance or in deployment, I can do things like this. Okay, in our examples, most likely you won't have to do that. Okay, because I'm not going to have you do anything that big. Although the assignments will be nasty enough. Okay, but you probably still won't need alternative. Okay, so at the moment this is a theoretical thing. So anything that you annotate with the alternative, it's not going to be used by default unless you explicitly turn it on in the beans XML. Okay. If you have an alternative turned on and a class that is not an alternative, so there's an ambiguous situation, then it will pick the enabled alternative. If more than one thing is enabled, then that's ambiguous, you get an error message. Okay, so again, there's some relatively sensible rules. And here's how you turn something on. You have a section alternatives. This has been around for a while, so I didn't update this version to the latest one. Doesn't matter. And what class, put down the class, that's it. Okay, so I have to do a little bit of work to turn on an alternative. Probably you don't remember it, you'd have to look it up, but there it is. Okay, so I don't know, that to me this always looks like a lot of stuff. On the other hand, this is pretty much it of what we're going to need for CDI beans for the whole term. Okay, so it's all, of course, quizable, and but a lot of it is mainly for reference. Okay, so things that I could get you on is how do you define qualifier? Okay, at least without worrying about the imports, you should be able to write down a qualifier. And how do you inject things? Well, again, that we saw that first in this week's lab. So the and by the way, last I looked, I didn't see a whole lot of people that finished this week's lab. Maybe you're leaving it for the weekend. Well, be careful because things will snowball on you. So this week's lab shouldn't be that bad. I would encourage you to, get it out of your way. Maybe, well, you've got a break this afternoon, maybe finish it off. Your choice. Okay. And let's see. Okay, loose coupling with strong typing. Okay, so I had a link here, which you can Google, because it looks in the various conversions, my link has disappeared. But there are some good articles on dependency injection. And again, that's if you're interested in the theory, you can look at that. If you're not interested in the theory, not a problem. I leave that up to you. And it turns out in the end, especially with the alternatives, that which we will, I don't know, I haven't yet decided how much I want to show you some of the alternatives later on. My current plan is I will show you some additional things, at least in 1 week. But this particular version of dependency injection looked at all of the other ways people were doing things and tried to come up with a nice version that made it easy to use. And I think they did a reasonable job, even though it's a bit brutal the first time you see it. Okay, so any questions? We're out of time. And I will unshare. Okay. And let's see, anything else that I need to tell you? We've got a little bit more that we have to cover before the first assignment comes out. So, don't have to worry about that yet. And I think that's about it. No questions? Okay, and so I'll remind you, my office hours are posted. So if you have any issues, you can't get things running in the lab assignments or whatever, only too happy to see you in office hours. Other times, maybe, but there's a lot on my schedule, so I can't guarantee other times. But if the office hours don't work for you, then you can always send me an email and request a specific time, and I can see if that's possible. Okay, good. So thank you very much. I actually have to leave, and then I've got somebody coming to my office hour, so I have to queue that up as well. Okay, and nothing else. I will see you next Monday. Take care.